Hi, I'm Chip Rogers, and welcome to the AAHOA Educational Experience. Thank you so much for being with us this week. We are talking about the issue of fair franchising and how legislation dealing with fair franchising is now beginning to bubble up at the state level. With me is a true expert on the issue. His name is Stanley Turkel. Stanley is one of the most widely publicized hotel consultants in the nation. He is also one of the leading voices and the pioneer in the fair franchising movement, so to speak. And this Stanley, while it has become a news item of late, particularly in the state of California, we'll talk about that. This idea of fair franchising is not new. You mentioned last week in our show that AAHOA was one of the leading voices a decade ago in coming up with 12 points of fair franchising. Just for our viewers who weren't able to watch last week, let's kind of recap a few of those things that go into what we would consider, or you would consider, a fair franchising model.
Indeed, thank you. Certainly the one most important issue has to do with encroachment, which is whether or not we as an owner or the individual hotel owner has some area of protection around his hotel wherein the franchisor cannot give out another franchise in our neighborhood. Well, you would think if you're just not interested, or not knowledgeable, I should say, about the hotel business, that would not be possible. That the franchise company would not want to destroy the business of its individual franchisee. Indeed, it's not that they want to destroy, they want 2 where there are now 1. They want 100 where there are now 50. They want 1,000 where there are now 500. I'm talking about motor inns with their name on it, producing revenue, percentage of all the room revenue, which goes to that franchise company as a profit. The franchisee, on the other hand, is a victim of that possibility of being, so encroachment is a very difficult issue, and it has not been resolved except that AAHOA put it into its 12 points of fair franchising and got very little favorable response. The large franchise companies, the names you know in the business, refused to agree with those 12 points. So it is therefore not any much better than it used to be. I want to make this point, however, because there is a lot of misunderstanding in the world and in the industry and in the American business world. First of all, I want everyone to understand that franchising is a big deal in our country, okay? The employment rates for franchise businesses, I wrote them down here, franchise industries employ more than 8 million workers in more than 500,000 businesses. Combined annual sales in these franchise businesses total more than $1 trillion in retail sales every year in the United States. So franchising is a big deal. It's a mode of operation. It's not a business, but it's a method by which you do business. So these issues that I'm talking about in the hotel world are very, very important. Let me say that many people think that there are federal laws that control the franchise business. There are no federal laws that control it, incredibly. One finds out that there are no federal laws requiring franchisors to abide by even the common law duty of good faith and dealings with their franchisees. There is no fiduciary duty when the franchisor handles its money, franchisee's money, in pooled advertising and marketing funds. No duty of due care that franchisors must show to their franchisees. There is no federal law that controls it. Therefore, and hence, all of the issues that arise, all of the oversight that arises, I should say, come out of state law. 50 individual states have 50 different franchise rules that apply in their location. So how difficult is that for an individual owner to deal with? And the individual franchise companies, they like it that way. The more fragmentation, the more confusion that exists, the franchise companies manipulate and control the environment in that regard.
And I want to point out, because we talk about fair franchising, and again, people think that this is a battle of franchisors against franchisees or vice versa. The reality is two things. Number one is that both the franchisors and the franchisees want franchising to work. Everybody has the same goal. It is a great model that both benefit from. But the question that arises is, can there be a fair set of standards that go into each of these agreements? And you talked about it earlier with encroachment, but issues like pricing, being allowed to set your own price, liquidated damages, how much do you have to pay if the franchise agreement is broken, renewals, can you expect as a franchisee to have your business renewed after a 20-year period, or are you just going to go out of business? Transfer of ownership, should you be allowed to transfer your business and sell it to somebody? I mean, that just seems so basically American that you could sell your business. The requirement that you be operated in, the relationship be done in good faith. I mean, this seems like something very simple. And what the fair franchising rules talk about are things not to try to make it better for the franchisees against the franchisors, but simply to have a basic set of standards that go into any agreement.
Exactly right. You've said it well.
And as you pointed out, there are no federal standards, so this must be tried at the state level.
Well, let me just take a few moments to tell our audience that in 1992, the state of Iowa passed a fair franchising law. This is pertinent because as we speak, the state of California
we're going to talk about that.
in the process of discussing in its legislature the possibility of a more fair franchising arrangement. Well, so in 1992, the state of Iowa passed a fair franchising law. It was regarded by the large franchise companies as such a danger to them, so offensive that all the major franchise companies pulled their business out of the state of Iowa. In other words, they stopped giving franchises out when renewals were up for discussion. They did not renew, and they gave no new franchises out. All the restaurant companies, all of the 7-Elevens, all of the service stations, which are franchised, as well as hotels and motels, those companies left Iowa and vowed not to come back until the law was changed. Well, how did the law did get changed, I might tell you. How did it get changed? If one looked carefully as to what happened in the years since 1992, those state legislators who voted for that law, when they came up for re-election, most of them had served for 2 years, they found an opponent running against them, funded by the large franchise companies. And so these legislators could not get re-elected. Over time, 2 years, 4 years, 6 years later, all of those legislators were gone, replaced by franchisor-friendly legislators. Therefore, and subsequently, the Iowa fair franchising rules got changed. They didn't go back to how bad they were before, but they certainly went back a long way. The franchise companies returned to Iowa and started giving out franchises, but this was after a 6-year period when this local warfare took place. So now we should talk about California.
We'll do that after the break.
Okay.
So
excellent.
Iowa, 1992 was the one time that a state took it upon themselves to enact a fair franchising law, and a few years later it was overturned because the franchisors, through the political process, certainly legal to do so, decided they didn't want to participate in a state that had those laws. California is now looking at it, and we're going to talk a lot about that because as big as Iowa is, California is monstrous, and this would be a seismic shift in the relationship between franchisees and franchisors, or at least a giant step forward for those who support fair franchising. I'm Chip Rogers. We'll be back right after this. Hi, and welcome back. I'm Chip Rogers, and you're watching The Educational Experience. With me this week is Stanley Turkel, one of the nation's leading experts when it comes to the hotel industry and one of the pioneers in the fair franchising movement. As we indicated in the last segment, fair franchising, there is no federal guidelines to this, so it must be tackled on a state-by-state basis. In 1992, Iowa passed a fair franchising law. A few years later, it was removed. Now the state of California And this, of course, is the nation's most populous state, is looking at doing so. And they have introduced a piece of legislation called the Level Playing Field for Small Business Act of 2012. First of all, what does the bill do? But more importantly, how about the name, Level Playing Field?
As far as I'm concerned, it's an absolutely wonderful name because it's just what I've been talking about. The playing field is so one-sided in favor of franchisors. To level the playing field would make it a better industry and would enable franchisees to have some traction in negotiating fairer deals. And if you look carefully at what California, the legislators are proposing, it's not revolutionary. It's not, going to overturn the United States government. It's not going to cause the Soviet Union to come back in force. It is a modest adjustment of the franchise rules. And it'll be interesting to see how the franchisor organizations respond to this. So far, I've heard a couple, and they have been upset, angry, and saying, we don't need such a law. Everything is fine in California. Well, it's not.
No, and what's interesting is that this legislation or this topic of fair franchising has not met with a lot of great success through the years, but already in California there seems to be a lot of movement in favor of it. The bill has already passed out of one committee of the California General Assembly, which is a good sign for those supporting fair franchising. But I think the difference may be is that franchisees during these tough economic times have begun to coalesce around each other and say, we really need to act as a large group together. It can't just be the hoteliers or the fast food restaurants. Everybody needs to come together. And you're beginning to see some movement behind, again, what you indicated is not a major dramatic shift. It's just a leveling of the playing field. Modest
at best. If I read to your audience just the 4 or 5 major elements of this California law, they can assess and see that it is modest. Here's what the California law says, that contractual agreements need to operate in good faith. That's not breaking the walls down. That's a rather modest requirement. Second, notice and cure periods to help prevent unnecessary agreement terminations. That means what? That you have to allow the franchisee, if something is wrong in his hotel, if that's what it is, time to repair it, to fix it, before you terminate the agreement. Again, a very modest proposal. Third, reasonable limitations on structural change during renewal. Reasonable limitations. During renewal, what we said before, and you properly noted that after we have run our motor in for all those years, now the franchisor is telling us we must do X, Y, and Z, rebuild the building, put in a playing field, put in a parking lot, a structure, a restaurant, whatever. This says modest and thoughtful and reasonable. Reasonable is not, in my book, anything revolutionary. Dispute resolution alternatives. Well, wonderful subject. I won't go into much detail except to say dispute resolution alternatives. There are inevitably disputes between the franchisor and the franchisee. How shall they be resolved if it comes to it? Well, in the agreements, the standard franchise agreements state that you as an owner, a franchisee, have no rights to a jury trial. You must accept arbitration. And it turns out that arbitration is unfair for the kind of disputes that we are likely to have, franchisor and franchisee. It also says that the choice of venue, that would be where the lawsuit takes place, okay, must be in the hometown of the franchise company. Not where, well, suppose the franchise company is in Maine and our hotel is in New Mexico. So we want to sue them. We have to send our attorney or get a corresponding attorney up in Maine because the lawsuit's going to take place there. Unfair.
Especially when the business is in New Mexico, right?
In New Mexico. Right. Our hotel is in New Mexico. The franchise company is in Maine. Unfair. Completely unfair. So this is a modest change. And I think there's just 2 more. Reasonable transfer of ownership qualifications. We want to sell our hotel. The standards should not be set so high that we can never find a buyer. We ought to be able to sell it to someone who is liquid, who is solvent, and who can meet the test, but the test should not be that you must be the richest person on earth to buy our motel.
And it's critical, I think, to point out that the purchaser, if you transfer ownership, they are still required to live under the contractual agreement. It's not like they get a new agreement.
Oh, every word,
right.
Every detail they must live up to. So finally, with these 5 modest requirements in the California law is this one: penalties for false and deceptive claims made in association with the sale of a franchise. What that means is that the franchise company cannot say to a new potential purchaser, this hotel is running at 88% occupancy at $200 average daily rate, when in fact it's running at 40% occupancy at $100 a night. In other words, they can't lie about that. Well, you'd say, why would they lie? They lie to attract a new investor to buy this motel. Maybe they don't call it a lie. They call it making it look better. In any event.
Artful persuasion.
Persuasion. These 5 elements in the California law are not revolutionary. They are modest, they are serious, and they are important to the protection of franchisee running of their business.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, but why then, when you hear these items, and they seem, as you pointed out, so reasonable, why do the franchisors fight so hard against them?
Because they love the situation they're in now. They love having no state law that causes them to do anything they don't want to do. They like having the state legislators under their thumb, wherein they provide campaign funding for them to get reelected. They hate to have a state like don't forget, California by itself might be the 8th largest country in the world. I mean, I may be off by a few.
Close.
Nevertheless, it's huge. So that's why franchisors don't want any changes. They've had it so good for so long. They have controlled this environment so well that they would like to continue to do that. And anyone who offers, like California does, to change it is considered to be an enemy of the state.
And I guess this may be the last question, but if you're a franchisor, I understand you don't want to give up any control. You like the way things are today. You're in the driver's seat. But wouldn't it seem like that if you had a franchise standards that were more equitable to both parties, that you could actually attract more people into the franchising industry? And as a franchisor, don't you want better franchisees?
All right, you are wonderful. What a great question. The franchise companies, the big ones that I have said, do not go along with the fair franchising idea and who are absolutely bent out of shape by this California possibility. They like it the way it is. Would they do more business if they eased up on their negotiations? Perhaps. And there are a few great examples. There's a company called America's Best Value Inns. They have grown faster than any other franchise company in the country, any other hotel franchise company, I should say, because they have negotiated fairly with their franchisees. So they, in the last 12 years, have grown to 1,000 motor inns across the country. And why is that? Because when you read their agreement and contrast it to the agreement of the larger companies, you might as well be looking at 2 different things in this world. These are fair. These still enable the company to make money, ABVI.
Clearly.
But they are certainly more modest, more fair than the tough franchise agreements that the large companies want to offer.
Well, this has certainly been educational. Stanley, I want to thank you personally for being here with us today. My guest has been Stanley Turkel, one of the nation's leading hotel experts. We have been talking about fair franchising, the legislation in California, and what may happen at the nation's largest state as it pertains to fair franchising. I want to thank you for watching this week. You can, of course, contact me, chip@ahoa.com. That's chip@ahoa.com. So long. We'll see you again next week.